From an official standpoint, although the invasion kicked off officially at midnight, October the 4th, with the tandem anti-satellite and cyber strikes, which basically made America's defenses completely incapable of coordinating or organizing any type of response due to a total lack of communications, in conjunction with the addition of the blanketing of electronic warfare systems located throughout the nation, operated by both Trojan shock forces and the external components invading the nation alike. The battle at Oklahoma City itself, the actual contact phase of the operation, kicked off 30 minutes later at 12:30 a.m., with the artillery barrage beginning from the 240 howitzers, both 152mm Type 83 self-propelled howitzers operated by some of the Combined Arms Army's artillery battalions, with the others being PLZ-05 155mm howitzer-based systems, which showered military targets throughout the metropolitan area as prior to the invasion, due to the international hostilities between America and its adversaries, now turned enemies, as well as the Sino-Russian naval drills off of both coasts, which had been pre-scheduled and were publicly aware insofar as the knowledge of such was concerned. The forces relating to the Americans were basically arrayed in this particular area, this 50-mile by 40-mile metropolitan area map of Oklahoma City, in a defensive posture, as one brigade out of the entire Oklahoma National Guard had so far by this point had been mobilized, and with the approval of the federal regime, the state regime had them deployed to essentially guard critical infrastructure throughout the city. As there were other Oklahoma Guard units that hadn't as of yet this point been mobilized, they were not available to aid in the defense, as the invasion was extremely sudden and rapid. And merely within the first 2 hours of the battle at Oklahoma City in particular, having kicked off at 12:30 a.m., with other battles kicking off right away in other areas of the invasion, with others kicking off slightly later, not much later, but this battle kicking off 30 minutes after the official beginning of the invasion, these forces had been completely caught off guard. And as artillery shells begin raining down, many clusters of armed civilians began to arise throughout the urban area, while many thousands more made desperate attempts to flee the city. A wise decision indeed, as it wouldn't be very long until the entire urban area would be completely locked down by the invasion forces, as they were now in earnest leaving their CCP regime properties and were now making for their various objectives located all throughout the area of the Oklahoma City greater metropolitan region. As initially a series of flank clearance operations, as well as dual highway security / counter military operations, were already well underway, even starting before 12:30 a.m. insofar as the movements of the units were concerned, before the actual fighting began to rage. At first, from 12:30 and onward, as armed civilian clusters began to arise throughout the metropolitan area, as people were hurriedly coming and going, spreading news of the ongoing invasion, as artillery shells began to slam into their targets, arousing people from their sleep and causing many to go and grab for their personal sidearms. There were a series of different refugees that were not combatants, as in non-combatant refugees that were unarmed, although in this part of the country many people were armed, but not everybody that had arms was willing or able even to put up much of a fight. And minus a small number of reactionary armed civilians either had fled the city or had gone into hiding to avoid the combat that was sure to come in their own particular smaller areas of the larger battle now unfolding. As this was largely the case, many civilians went into hiding in the city's labyrinth of underground tunnels and basements and sewer systems, while others had fled the city outright before the Chinese were even able to physically get to and secure the entrances and exits to the city proper, as the interstates were a key objective of this whole invasion for the Trojan shock army components, as control thereof was of the utmost paramount importance. This to allow not only for ease of logistics, but also for the external invasion components coming in from Mexico and Canada, respectively, but in this particular case, as it related to Oklahoma City, the Mexican external components, to proceed north up I-35, the most vital of all the highways within this major road and rail junction with which they set out to control. These forces hurriedly moved into position, and not only to engage their primary military target of Tinker Air Force Base, but also the dispersed military units of the Army Guard forces of the Oklahoma Army National Guard's 45th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, widely distributed largely in the central and eastern portions of the city, as by the time this force had been assembled and mobilized, they were tasked essentially primarily with securing the key infrastructure of the city, and this even included the Tinker Air Force Base itself, in a move similar to that which was seen occurring at the Shepherd Air Base battle, with the TRADOC elements being shuttled down there to provide additional security to that installation, leaving a skeleton crew behind to continue with the training operations at the installation of Fort Sill, which were not to be, as Fort Sill would also come under invasion simultaneously to the Shepherd Air Base battle and all the other battles occurring within the south central invasion sector of Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. As all of this was occurring, the Chinese were conducting their flank clearance operations, with the different combined arms brigades allocating some of their battalions to this task, while others went directly for the more important objectives, such as control of the airfields and airports, Tinker Air Force Base, and to engage and destroy American combat units in the field, most of which were now gathered between an array of sewage and water treatment facilities, the airbase, or downtown to protect the state regime district and downtown areas. The Walters Power International plant had not had a chance to be adequately staffed with security personnel from the 45th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, as the invasion happened suddenly before the 1st of the 160th, a field artillery battalion, had the opportunity to even send one of its batteries to secure this power plant. And although there was a skeleton crew of military forces in the form of a reserve force mixed together with local law enforcement agencies protecting a water treatment facility, the OG&E Mustang plant had not either had a chance to be fully staffed with any additional military personnel, which was a completely open power plant in terms of its level of security, being only staffed with its particular normal security detail, which was hired to protect this plant. The same was the case with the OG&E Frontier plant. Again, there was to be reserve and or guard forces sent to the OG&E Frontier power plant, but this had not had the chance to unfold. And it would take a little bit of time for the Chinese forces now hurriedly en route to the plant to secure it to arrive and lock down this facility, as well as other armored battalions striking to the northwest of the Oklahoma City area to attack and secure the OG&E plant, in conjunction with the forces of the 190th Combined Arms Brigade, who for their part were more focused with securing the downtown area from its north, from the northern end of it, in conjunction with the Walters Power International plant, which was already secured in the opening hours of the battle. As it related to the Canadian County Municipal Airport, also known as the Sundance Regional Airport, or Municipal Airport rather, that had been taken by a mechanized infantry battalion and the short-range air defense battalion belonging to the 190th Combined Arms Brigade, both having moved in before the mechanized infantry battalion was called to a new task, while the air defense battalion held the airport. And the new task was to hurriedly lock in a rapidly emerging threat fairly close to the lighter units of the 58th PLA Group Army, which consisted of its headquarters battalion, which was an independent battalion that encapsulated the entire Group Army's command elements of the whole 58th PLA Group Army, which was comprised of all of these different brigades and regiments, along with the support brigade, the 58th Support Brigade itself, a primary logistical element of the whole 58th Group Army, as well as the 58th Signals Intelligence Regiment / EW Regiment, which itself was responsible for the electronic warfare jamming blanketing this entire combat region as it related to the Oklahoma City metropolitan area. As it pertained to the independent 58th Special Operations Battalion, it was the main force of combat troops in this particular area, beginning on a CCP property adjacent to the property upon which the Independent Headquarters Battalion over the entire 58th began upon, and in line with the artificial intelligence directing the most efficient use of forces and equipment, it was decided that because of this rapidly emerging threat of over 1,000 armed American civilian militia forces, which, if allowed to move out of the area within which they were cropping up, could potentially become a foreseeable threat to some of the lighter armed units that were providing vital tasks, such as the 58th Signals Intelligence / EW Regiment, as these troops were not combat troops but were support troops, and the equipment they operated was very delicate, and therefore guerrilla-like forces or partisan-like elements in the form of this fairly moderately sized force of civilian militia forces could never be allowed to get anywhere near the CCP properties, which contained the main logistical elements and electronic warfare elements, as well as even the command elements over the entire 58th Group Army. Therefore, although the 58th Independent Special Operations Battalion had been tasked with moving in to capture the key political figures of the state as they were high priority on the deck of cards, along with military leadership for the state of Oklahoma, as well as also partaking in the destruction of the 1st of the 60th Artillery Battalion, which was a major target for the invasion forces. They would be utilized to aid an armored battalion belonging to the 58th Group Army's 190th Combined Arms Brigade. They would be aiding this battalion, as well as the Mechanized Infantry Battalion earlier mentioned that seized control of the Sundance Municipal Airport here, in surrounding and destroying this element of American civilian militia type of forces. And as that was going on, this battalion, as it was fighting alongside of this armored force, would be utilized as an elite infantry type force that would be gradually, according to the original plan, shuttled by transport helos of the Transportation Helicopter Battalion of the 58th Aviation Regiment of the 58th PLA Group Army into the downtown area as these helicopters flew on the outer radius of the battle to avoid any potential friendly fire mishaps as per the original battle plans, and flew at treetop level and maintained their ability to avoid any potential ground fire from also American civilians in this manner as they flew rapidly over the ground at this type of height and speed and were unable to be honed in on by small arms. And therefore, they took the easiest path of least resistance, and flew on the outskirts of the metro area before arriving, after having passed the area upon which this element was to be surrounded and destroyed, to pick up and shuttle back and forth between the downtown landing zone here and the forces fighting here, and would gradually, being able to take one company at a time, move back and forth until they had shuttled all the companies that were fighting alongside the Armored Battalion and Mechanized Infantry Battalion of the 190th into the landing zone in order to conduct their operations in the center of the city, that would later be relieved, as per the original planning, by a mechanized infantry battalion of the 53rd that was moving in through the center of the urban area to move north and engage and destroy armed civilians in the opening hours of the fighting before moving into the entertainment district and then in downtown to link up with the special operators who by then would be there. This battle would last in its entire totality, actually, 2 days, but the main fighting would be over in 24 hours. As this was a well spread out, large metropolitan area, and due to the fact of there being so many objectives, due to the sheer scope and scale of this operation and the number of objectives needing to be captured, it was anticipated to take at least a day, but it would end up taking 2. As by the time all the enemy military forces would have been destroyed, there would still be residual combat from tiny bands of armed civilians that would crop up after the first groups of armed civilians, which numbered 5,200 in total on this map, will have been destroyed. But this militia force, out of all the civilian reactionary forces on the map, was by far the most dangerous, and being in close proximity to the command elements, main logistical elements, and the electronic warfare elements needed to be dealt with swiftly. At the same time this operation would be going on, carried out by the Special Operations Battalion alongside the Armored Battalion and Mech Infantry Battalion of the 190th, another operation was going on, which itself was beginning after the destruction by the Attack Helicopter Battalion of the 58th Aviation, which had encircled and surrounded armed civilians that had been cropping up in this area, destroying many of them before returning to their CCP property to reload on weapons and armaments for their next mission, which was to go after a area where there was a grouping of 750 armed civilian and local LEO forces, which themselves, as it related to the 50 local LEO forces and the 700 armed civilians, were trying to set up an ad hoc refugee camp, which was taking the local high school in this semi-rural suburban area of Oklahoma City and were transforming it into an ad hoc refugee site, as by this point, many unarmed civilians, in addition to the armed civilians, had been fleeing their homes and looking for a relatively safe place to congregate during the intensive shelling that was by this point occurring. As the fighting would wind down after 2, with Tinker Air Force Base being captured, at the same time, as it started at 1:30, at the same time, by about 1 to 2, there would be a heavy fight in this area as the attack helicopter battalion, after having destroyed on the ground an armed civilian element with their Z-10 attack helicopters, would be flying into combat again to support 2 battalions from 2 different Combined Arms Brigades of the 58th Group Army, the 93rd Combined Arms Brigade committing 1 mechanized infantry battalion, with the other mechanized infantry battalion committed to this battle coming from the 53rd, who was also committing their armored battalion, combat engineer battalion, and another of their mechanized infantry battalions to the Tinker Battle that was occurring concurrently to this. As this battle again began at 1 and would end at 2, it started at the same time the combat with the armed civilians began that had fled artillery fire to seek refuge in this water treatment plant to the south of Tinker, as this mechanized infantry battalion surrounded and destroyed them before by 1:30 beginning to surround the base on the western side of it. These forces were now about to be attacked, as early on other flank clearing operations against armed civilian bands had by this point occurred, as this MiG-35 squadron, Russia's only MiG-35 squadron, had passed along with a Su-27 squadron and an Su-35 squadron to engage American forces at the Tulsa area, primarily the 125th Squadron of the 138th Wing of the Air National Guard, also being hit by tactical ballistic missiles and cruise missiles beginning to fire at 2. These forces were moving in and surrounding and destroying this combat engineer battalion of the 93rd, this mechanized infantry battalion of the 93rd, in conjunction with this one, securing I-44 and moving to engage and destroy armed civilians here before moving to the north to destroy another pocket, and with heavy artillery support coming from the 118th Combined Arms Brigade, as well as ground units of the 118th Combined Arms Brigade, a combat engineer battalion surrounding and destroying armed civilians adjacent to 135, along with this mechanized infantry battalion doing the same, before they all raced into the downtown area to secure it, along with this mechanized infantry battalion and combat engineer battalion joining them, coming from the 190th Combined Arms Brigade. These forces were conducting their assault with heavy artillery support against this large cluster of armed civilians, which included the local law enforcement element helping to establish a refugee camp at the high school located within this area in particular. As the 2 mechanized infantry battalions closed in, one taking the center and south to swing around, along with the other taking the north to link up with it, the battalion from the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade was moving in from the southern part of this encirclement, along with the aviation battalion, the attack helicopter battalion of aviation assets with its 4 flying companies, not counting its ground crew and maintenance companies, was now encroaching on the area as well to give them heavy support in the form of their attack helicopters, which would also be used shortly thereafter in the next fight against the first of the 279th Infantry Regiment, which was a battalion of mechanized infantry that had crossed the river already by this point, as in the first 2 hours they got themselves together due to the communication issues and managed to move, albeit slowly as a group, to move to their initially planned location, which was to secure this major water and sewage treatment facility and would therefore, shortly after this battle, be engaged by the same forces involved in it, as well as the attack helicopters and even the recon helicopter battalion of armed reconnaissance helicopters participating as well. But for the time being, the battle was focused on securing the flanks for the push against the military forces, as these two battalions from the 93rd and 53rd Combined Arms Brigades moved in with heavy artillery fire support and helicopter support from the attack helicopter battalion, freshly reloaded after having destroyed civilians on the outskirts of the city limits here, and moved into the suburb to engage these forces. At this map, essentially, this is only one segment of the battle against the larger armed civilian element. This is a farmhouse with there being a road off map going north and south. This is a smashed one that had been destroyed, as there had been armed civilians inside of it that had been spotted, and it was obliterated by ground fire, as well as in conjunction with 25 millimeter HE ammunition fired from the Gatling gun on the front of this Z-10 attack helicopter. And there were pictured just one full company of Z-10 attack helicopters with two helos of another company off map as they made a curvature around the larger battlefield, this particular map only being a 1.5 mile by 1 mile battle map. And prominent feature on this map, besides there being wooded areas interspersed throughout it, and also rural roads or semi-rural roads, as this was a semi-rural suburban area of Oklahoma City, there was a drainage ditch system that ran parallel to this road right here, and also had a branch of it separating this particular ranch property from the high school campus. And this was the football field right here, this being the high school, and this being its parking lots right here, as they could normally, the vehicles and buses would go up here and drop off people and pull out. And within the drainage ditch, many armed American civilians had taken up positions to try to take cover from the enormous volume of fire coming from the mechanized infantry forces. Again, there were two full battalions involved in this surround and destroy effort, with each mechanized infantry battalion having, of course, a headquarters company, their own fire support company, which was essentially like a light artillery company because they had PLL-05 heavy assault gun / mortars, as they could be used in a direct fire assault gun capacity or as a fairly long range mortar, and heavy mortar at that, because they were 120 millimeters. So essentially, they also had multiple launch 130 millimeter towed rocket systems. They had two platoons of those and a platoon of PLL-05s, along with the headquarters platoon, which comprised the full fire support company in each mechanized infantry battalion. And both the 130 millimeter rockets and heavy mortar rounds were being fired, as these indicate the mortar strikes here, here, here. And, of course, these two here in conjunction with these here. These are 5 mortars impacting 120 millimeter heavy mortars. And, of course, there was also the 130 millimeter rockets impacting right here. And there was also 57 millimeter rockets impacting as well, fired from these helicopters that had 57 millimeter rocket pods, 2 on each helicopter. And although they could carry a wide range of different types of missiles, whether they were wire-guided missiles, laser-guided missiles, or millimeter-wave radar-guided missiles, and more, these were armed with the wire-guided HJ-08 anti-tank missiles. And essentially what's occurring here is the local sheriff's department that was trying to set up a refugee center had cots that were beginning to be laid out in the gym here. They had no idea how rapidly Chinese forces would advance on their location And they seemed to believe that the Americans would be able to establish some sort of cohesive line of defense, but because there was no communications, they had no real way of knowing, and they just did this basically on a whim as far as the executive decision being made by local authorities to try to conduct some type of refugee support operations. And they had already set up one tent, but they had no time to set up many more by the time the invasion forces had arrived. The gymnasium was already full of unarmed refugees in conjunction with all of these armed civilian elements that were out and about and trying to take cover and also even fight from the drainage ditch positions. And they were trying to run through here in order to have better cover below the ground level that they could duck if there was incoming. But it didn't serve them very well, as these helicopters were able to fire rockets right into the drainage ditch right here, which, as you can see by this encapsulated arrow, as these forces are trying to move ahead, some have already been wiped out that are beneath this orange and also on the outer edges of it right here and here and also here. This pickup truck is about to be hit by an HJ-08 anti-tank missile. This barn's about to be obliterated by an HJ-08 anti-tank missile. And there's also the CH-901A loitering munitions that were fired by the close-by 93rd Combined Arms Brigade's headquarters battalion's drone section, fired directly a short distance across the Oklahoma River in support of the mechanized infantry of theirs and the mechanized infantry battalion of the 53rd that were both assaulting this position at the same time. And as these CH-901As entered the map here, they were all armed with fragmentation warheads instead of HE or heat warheads. And these fragmentation warheads were a superb choice for use against the dismounted infantry type forces that they were being utilized against. And by infantry type forces, I'm referring to both the local law enforcement as well as the armed reactionary American civilians with their small arms. As they were running through these wooded areas, as this brown shading here indicates wooded or forested areas, including little bits of it here and here, and it was well dispersed. I mean, there was areas where it was thicker than others, like where this drainage ditch began and going into the main drainage ditch here, which separated this ranch property from the school campus here. And there's a farmhouse here. They were running through this area as other Chinese forces of the battalions, of the two battalions, there being 3 companies of 1 battalion pictured on this particular map of the mechanized infantry, and 1 full company of the attack helicopters and 2 attack helicopters from another company on this particular map, with more off map to the south and to the north, with a whole different battalion off the map to the north, swinging around to surround this area and linking up with the other companies of this battalion, as this was only 3 companies on the ground with their combat platoons and a headquarters platoon element right here, with the other headquarters platoon right here of the 2 leading companies that are in the front right here, and one moving in here and the other right here. And there's a 3rd company which consists of this platoon right here of a VN-20 infantry fighting vehicle and 4 Type 89A armor personnel carriers, same here, and the same here, with its headquarters platoon even further afield off the map to the east. As they were moving in and all of this was going on, drone-directed artillery fire had begun to come in exceedingly precise as the quadcopter reconnaissance drones of the advancing mechanized infantry forces were hovering all throughout this battlefield, calling in the precise locations for mortar strikes at the edge of this wood line where armed civilians had been spotted by higher flying recon drones such as the WZ-8s orbiting the entire urban area, running into these wooded areas, including the lower level platoon and squad level reconnaissance quadcopter reconnaissance drones. And as they were spotted moving into the wooded area, massive imminent artillery strikes had been called in to land and completely annihilate this massive group of armed civilians running through the area who were already being destroyed at the very opening of this map, as these blasts of artillery shelling indicate, with more on the way, as imminently artillery shells land at all of these markers. This barn and silo structure was completely destroyed by these blasts going on right here. This pickup truck is about to be hit by an HJ-08 anti-tank missile. This house that armed civilians were spotted running into and hiding within is being hit by an HJ-08 anti-tank missile and destroyed as it's completely surrounded in red like this barn. The fragmentation warhead-equipped CH-901A loitering munitions were all set to AI targeting parameters, and they began to immediately impact groupings of these armed civilians as they went into or emerged from these wooded areas as so. Some even being impacted before they even are able to jump into this drainage ditch to hide. And while these attack helicopters fired their salvos of 57mm rockets from their rocket pods, their 25mm chain guns being equipped with HE ammunition were hitting and destroying groupings of them within these drainage ditch areas, as indicated by this red around this area and this red encapsulated arrow, as they were all moving in this general direction but being wiped out along the way, including by the dismounted forces from this platoon right here, dismounting and bounding and covering tactically, as these houses had already been cleared along the way earlier. As these two leading companies moved into positions, this company sat back as a reserve type of force, including the vehicle, the lead IFV that was right beneath this helicopter right here. You can barely see it, but they sat back as a reserve type of element. In case to be called forward for an attack, they could be called forward, but it would be unnecessary, as again, the total 750 armed combatants now trapped within this pocket, as both battalions slammed shut the trap, were being completely annihilated by the concentration of artillery fire from 155 and 152 millimeter artillery shells fired by the Type 83 152 millimeter self-propelled howitzers, or the PLZ-05 self-propelled 155 millimeter howitzers, as some of these combined arms brigades of the 58th PLA Group Army were either armed with the artillery battalions were either armed with the Type 83s or the PLZ-05s. The forces on the ground moving in, and as this platoon here in this area had dismounted already, two dismounted squads, they advanced against this grouping of armed civilians trying to take fighting positions below this helo that had just moved ahead to begin to attack the MRAPs that belonged to the sheriff's department. And this was an ambulance right here that were trying to establish their refugee center. They had been attacked from these ground forces at the same time this helo moved up, and were basically taken out by grenades, QJS-201 light machine gun fire, QBZ-95 fire. There was only 5 of them right here, and they were completely taken out. And as this platoon moved up with their vehicles. The vehicles were also firing in this direction as well against the vehicles that were being hit also by anti-tank missiles fired from the attack helicopter here. And the rockets were hitting this side of the school where there were armed civilians inside trying to utilize it as a type of strong point or a hard point, as this was a very sturdy building in terms of the building materials. It was built out of brick and concrete and, of course, had steel beams to reinforce the floors of it, and the roof wasn't certainly made to withstand the abuse it took, but the bottom floor of it was actually somewhat relatively well protected, although the rockets beginning to strike against the facade gradually shredded it open to pieces, being fired by this helicopter and this helicopter, while this one was firing this way. And 130 millimeter rockets began to come in and impact here and even against this building as well. As all of these green dots to signify individual personnel or people surrounded these armed civilians and the LEO personnel are surrounded by red, that means they're completely annihilated at the opening of this map at the moment this map is shown. They are basically maneuvering into position with this platoon here, with this vehicle moving up here, while taking fire while this group's running. They're being fired at as these people are turning and firing over the ledge at them. But it's doing nothing to these vehicles, of course. And as they move up, they're continuing to lay down fire up this way. So they're really taking a whole slew of fire from above, from the attack helos firing their chain guns, their 25 millimeter HE ammunition into this, these vehicles firing up into it this way. And of course, the rocket fire going into the center of this one and impacting on the ground, taking out a whole grouping of them underneath this flame and on the edges of it here. This fire marker indicates where rockets are blasting and igniting. And basically, this area right here, these two silos, is being hit ruthlessly by rocket fire, 57 millimeter and 130 millimeter rocket fire, as indicated by the rocket fire marker, by the rocket strike marker, I mean, and these armed civilians are being wiped out. And this vehicle right here, this pickup truck being used as a technical, has been targeted by an HJ-08 anti-tank missile and is being hit and destroyed, just like this barn full of armed reactionary civilian group here is being hit and destroyed. As this group is running through this area, they're being targeted by ground-based weapons, chain guns, mortars, rocket fire, and also further back artillery, which was hitting all throughout this wooded area, CH-901A, loitering munition strikes, as well as this group up here being hit by artillery, CH-901As, anti-tank missile coming from this Z-10 attack helicopter, which is firing its chain gun this way, ostensibly against armed civilians not seen off the map. And this group here, including them back here, are running in this general direction, but they're being fired at by the small arms from these two dismounted squads with support from their vehicles, which are sweeping all these sectors of fire and firing against the forces in this drainage ditch and against them, as well as rockets being fired from the attack helicopters, rockets pods, which are impacting right here and wiping out armed civilians here, and those running on the periphery right here that are getting cut down by the shrapnel at the time they were running. This group here has been completely wiped out. And as these troops here in the staggered formation and wedge formation here, tactically bound in cover, with the staggered formation becoming a wedge formation as they get over the fencing here, they bounded ahead of the wedge formation. Then the wedge, they laid down fire, but they were taking some fire from further back. As this group moved into the area, they began to lay down fire from their prone position that they were in here, and allowing for them to climb the fence and bound further ahead, where they lay down and lay down fire. And then they bound again, lay down fire, and then they bound again, lay down fire, and then they stopped taking fire by the time each squad got to this position, as they had by that point eliminated all of these forces here. This house was already destroyed by that point by the anti-tank missile at the opening of this map. There's very many things happening, again, as always, at the same exact time. So showing them in order, as always, is very difficult, but it is going to be attempted as best as possible. This ranch right here, from which this fence line was crossed by these two bounding and covering squads with heavy support from their attack helicopter hovering behind and above them, and another here, allowed for these forces to quickly and easily get into fighting position and to storm this shed outside of the farmhouse right here. This squad stormed and checked the shed before going around it and moving to the fence, while this squad of dismounts crossed the fence and stormed this house and checked it before this squad moved up to the corner of the house and got in the prone position for this squad to bound out the front door and then lay in the prone position before firing and throwing grenades across the road and into the drainage ditch. As again, this was happening at the same time as all this fire was happening here, and they were being fired at here by the 130 millimeter rockets and the 57 millimeter rockets from the helicopters and the chain gun fire and the anti-tank missiles being fired, and this platoon maneuvering into position. By the time these vehicles got here, they had dismounted the last of their squads, as two squads were already dismounted at the time, and they outflanked the trench here, getting into it, firing this way, while these squads had dismounted and fired this way before getting into the drainage ditch and using it as their own fighting position to eliminate these forces. While that was going on, these two combat platoons had linked up and moved through this area before splitting up again, with one going this way and one going this way, long after these forces here had been KIA'd, which is why there's no green on this one right here, before moving around this area and then up to the corner of this building before dismounting three squads to check the building, two going into the gym and one going to the corner to hold the corner until they went inside before bounding against this building in a rolling T formation to watch the upper floors of the windows of it for any enemy fire, before taking fire as they kicked in the door and entered in the first floor, while the two other dismounted squads got out here. At the same time, they were running through here, taking shells and getting hit by CH-901As. They took a little bit of fire, but the fire they meted out was so severe, I mean, it completely annihilated them, as the story is told by this red encapsulated arrow, as this was the general direction they were running in, and they were running out this way. These forces here were running into the ditch. This truck that was used as a technical, as there were men with rifles in the back, and this grouping of armed civilians running this way were hit by CH-901As, like one right here, while this one hit this group here, and also being hit as this group of 5 vehicles, this one platoon from these two platoons, this platoon of vehicles led by its infantry fighting vehicle, were firing this way. As they stopped here temporarily while they went around this way, they went around the other side. And some of those even alive at this point that were in this ditch here were firing up at them, but they were the gunners on the turrets with their 12.7 millimeter machine guns fired down and into this ditch and completely mowed them down, while the infantry fighting vehicle, the VN-20, leading the procession of this platoon here, just completely obliterated this pickup truck and whoever was even still alive out of this group that was running this way. This was all happening at the same time as the actions up here was happening, and as these forces bounded and covered to the edge of this trench line, this drainage ditch, and began to fire down into it or throw grenades into it as these vehicles were firing into it, that all happened at the same time as well. While the fire called in from the fire support company had put a lot of pressure on these armed civilians in this area here, with the attack helicopters, rocket pods, and anti-tank missiles coming in and and also the mortar fire coming in even further back, it was all too destructive. And these forces were completely and totally wiped out in a matter of minutes. This battle did not last for a very long time at all. And it started at around the same time as the fighting at Tinker was beginning to come to its end. I mean, it ended about the same time the fighting at Tinker was about to come to its end. This was ending shortly after 2 a.m. This was a very, very heavy fight. And it lasted some roughly 40 minutes from beginning to end, as this was only one section of the larger battle, because it still took some time for the other companies of the 2 battalions to maneuver in the south and in the north to completely encircle and surround it, and then for all the artillery and mortars and rockets and missile fire to completely reduce and then eliminate everybody in this pocket. As the school was methodically cleared room to room by these 3 squads, the 2 that went in the gym had eliminated or captured everybody that was in there, including refugees, while this other squad went in the bottom this way and had to clear out the rest of the armed civilians out of there. There were 40 total armed civilians in this entire building, which is what this is here, but because it's surrounded in red, it means they were all either KIA'd or captured. And this took a bit of time because 3 squads had to go through methodically and clear that building out. So this was roughly a 40-minute battle all in all. It lasted actually even longer than did the battle at Tinker, because even after this area here was cleared and saturated by artillery fire, these forces still had to move in. Even after clearing the refugee center here, they still had to move in and sweep this whole area too, which took some time. And although there were a lot of companies able to do it, to partake in that, it still took time to do. And it took 40 minutes with all the companies closing in on the area to completely and fully sweep it for any survivors, similar to like a cordon and sweep of a whole grid square. It would take a little bit of time to do that, even if you had the level of forces that you had surrounding the area. There were 2,000 Chinese troops ostensibly surrounding this whole area, and they had to go through methodically and clear it. So although the ferocious, enormous barrage of munitions from artillery to lighter artillery like the heavy mortars and the 130 millimeter rockets to the fired munitions from the helicopters, the 100 millimeter and 30 millimeter autocannons from the IFVs, which had HE rounds. I mean, all of that fire, and also ground-based fire from the dismounts, whether it be anti-personnel or anti-tank rocket-propelled grenades, tube-launched 35 millimeter grenades from beneath the QBZ-95 rifle barrels, or whether it was hand grenades, or whether it was even whole anti-tank missiles. It still took time to essentially eliminate all 750 of these American forces, because 750, that's almost a battalion in American terms. So basically is a battalion in American sizes anyhow, and if it was an American military unit. But these were armed civilians prosecuting a guerrilla type of defense, because that's all they could do. And though they managed to inflict a few casualties on the Chi-Coms, they mostly were able to cause some WIAs, and they only caused 1 KIA, but it still took time to completely destroy this pocket. And as this fighting would end by shortly after 2, just like the fighting at Tinker Air Force Base wrapped up shortly after 2, these forces would be regrouping for the next phase of their operation, which was to basically go after the 1st of the 279th spotted moving into the area that they were tasked with defending to begin with, which was a water treatment center. As the orbiting W-8 ISR, these high-altitude stealth recon drones, had spotted them moving as a unit into this area, these forces, clearing their flanks of an armed civilian menace in conjunction with the artillery fire fired from these two artillery battalions, were regrouping to prepare to assault their main objective, being the 1st of the 279th, this mechanized infantry battalion of the American forces moving into this area. And they would have relatively generous air support in so doing, as although the primary goal at this point in the invasion for the J-11 fighters was to provide total air dominance over this area just in case somehow, some way, the Americans had an air force at this point, although their air force was being picked apart in these opening hours. They would be called in to conduct strafing attacks on the columns of American forces that would be moving through this particular area here, in conjunction with the attack and armed recon helos, CH-901A loitering munitions, and ground-based fire, as well as artillery fire provided by the 93rd Combined Arms Brigade's Artillery Battalion, the same battalion that provided support to this operation here, as well as in conjunction with the 53rd Combined Arms Brigade's battalion, also artillery battalion, also providing support there. But it was primarily focused mostly on the Tinker Air Base while all of this was wrapping up. These forces were about to move and conduct their next battle in this larger battle of the OKC Battle space. In the next video of this hypothetical invasion docu-series will be the fighting that occurred against American armed civilian militia forces who actually were staffed with men that actually had experience and or training that were former American military that organized this force around the basis of their experience, and would be, again, in combat against special operations troops serving at this battle as elite infantry support, backing up their armored battalion and another mechanized infantry battalion now moving on from the recently captured Sundance Municipal Airport, which was being at this time held by the Short Range Air Defense Battalion as they moved in for the proverbial kill and literal kill against these forces. As this would be unfolding again, this battalion, company by company, as each trip was conducted in a shuttling manner, as they would shuttle back and forth to pick up a company at a time of this battalion, they would be fighting in the downtown area, going for one of their major objectives, which was the 1st of the 60th, which by this point, due to counter battery fire, was taking enormous casualties, but would be finished off because one of their batteries was tasked with guarding the actual cap buildings, the complex itself, and would not be therefore hit by artillery because it was wanted that the special operations troops would capture the leadership alive that was there. So one full battery from this battalion would actually be taken on by the special operations troops. But that would be after the first company arrived at this landing zone and established security around the landing zone, while others would be gradually shuttled in from the back and forth flights of transport helos of the Transport Helo Battalion of the 58th Aviation Regiment, which, as actually a wise use of their special operations troops, they would be doing more this way. They got the most out of them essentially this way by using them at first while they waited on their flights, to help provide infantry support, elite infantry support, as these are special operators, to the armored battalion, who had its own armored infantry, but due to having only 2 companies of armored infantry within them, adding the special operations troops would make getting rid of these forces that threatened potentially the sensitive equipment of the electronic warfare units, both highly efficient, while at the same time also allowing them to conduct their original objective according to the original mission plan anyway, because it would have still taken them time to shuttle in the full battalion anyhow. So using them in this capacity, as they were gradually being shuttled from a pickup landing zone here and into their LZ in the downtown area back and forth, would give them time to both destroy this group while also establishing them downtown to basically surround and destroy these forces here and capture the political leadership as originally planned. All tailored according to the artificial intelligence system, which was highly advanced and highly aided in the flexibility and everything else as it regarded the plans of the invasion. It aided in flexibility, more efficient use of troops and resources, cut down on friendly fire, and more. And it advised the commanders on the ground, particularly those in charge of the entire 58th PLA Group Army within the Independent Headquarters Battalion, to utilize these forces in such a way. As although they were, according to previous intelligence, fully aware there was an armed civilian militia force in the area, they hadn't anticipated them to be forming together so close to CCP properties where such sensitive equipment as operated by their electronic warfare battalion was, and therefore it was deemed a brilliant idea to use this force in this way instead of just having them sit around and wait to be picked up from their CCP property they began on to be flown downtown, where they could be used to do this in conjunction with the armored battalion and mechanized infantry battalion. And as there was ample activity going on at this point, at the same time as this battle was going on as well. And also the establishment of the landing zone and securing thereof was going on as well. And by this point in the fighting, this group of armed civilians was being destroyed by 2 a.m. as well. As all of this over here, this battle at Tinker and this battle with armed civilians here ended just after 2 a.m., and this one was ending just shortly after 2 a.m., allowing for this mechanized infantry battalion to begin its drive, first to pause for logistical pause at 240, one of the ring roads of the city here, before moving on to engage what would then be the heavily battered 2nd of the 134th itself, a airborne infantry battalion within the National Guard. And by this point, fire being called in from the 77th Artillery Brigade of the 77th PLA Group Army, now currently fighting in Fort Sill Battle, had been able to use their extremely long-range A300 300mm rocket systems from that one battalion of A300s within that brigade to fire in direct support, shelling the city heavily with 300mm rockets, in direct support of operations in Oklahoma City, Sherman Air Base Battle, Fort Sill Battle, and even fighting in fire missions for the fight going on in Dallas-Fort Worth in that battle. And there was another rocket strike called in on the armed civilian militia forces, also conducted by the A300 systems of that battalion of A300s, in support of the Special Operations Troops, the Armored Battalion, and Mechanized Infantry Battalion moving in to completely destroy them, as well as also howitzer artillery support coming from the 190th Combined Arms Brigade of the 58th PLA Group Army. This battle against the civilian militia forces will be explored in the next video of the hypothetical invasion documentary series on fourth generation warfare.